I was reading somewhere, and I should have gone back and looked to see what book it was, so I can't credit whoever wrote it, but just know it's not my idea. And the author in this book was asking the question of how you might define faith. And so he came up with a lot of the answers that many of us would, belief and conviction and things like that. And he said one of the helpful things for him in trying to define faith was to try to figure out what would you say is the opposite of faith? And so the natural place a lot of us would probably go is unfaithful, or if you were to think of the idea of with belief, we would think of disbelief, as we talked about last time with faith and doubt, that you've got doubt as kind of this middle area where you're double-minded between the single-mindedness of either belief or disbelief. And he took me to a place in Scripture I did not expect to go when he was trying to define this. The parable of the talents in Matthew chapter 25. We don't have it on the screens, but it's familiar enough for most of us that you'll remember that each of these three servants of the master was given a different amount of talents to hang on to, do something with while the master was gone, and then the master would come back and check. And the first two guys, they end up with more talents than they started with because they went and made something out of that. And talents, by the way, in case you've forgotten, in Matthew 25 was money, not talents as we think of today. But they being on the opposite side of faithful, then you start to see some of what James talks about in James 2 that we're going to talk about tonight. The idea that faith is something that shows itself not in a statement, not in what you say, but in what you do and in the way you live. Normally would. So I mentioned my lawn to you this morning. I spent Saturday morning redoing the brakes on my daughter-in-law's car. So I'm there in my garage, and I have put the jack under the car, and I have lifted the car up. And what they teach you in these things, or what everybody says you're supposed to do is, you put the jack under the car, and you put the car up, and then you put jack stands under the car, which if you're not a mechanic or just these little metal contraptions that are made to hold the car should the jack fail. Which is like the last thing in the world you'd want to happen. And so you raise it, and then you kind of let it rest on the jack stands. I usually leave the jack there too, so there's like 3 points of contact with the car. And then they tell you you're also supposed to put chocks on the wheel, which is like these two little triangular things to make sure the car doesn't accidentally roll one way or the other. Now, there are all kinds of steps in there that if you are a guy in a hurry like me that doesn't like extra steps, it would be easy to talk yourself out of until you envision being under the car. And then you begin to realize, based on what everyone who knows more than me has said at this point, I'm going to take the extra steps. Now, the funny thing was, as I was under the car, with all of these stands under it and the triangles and everything else, it hit me that I had done David's brakes the previous week, and I forgot totally about the chocks. Luckily, it never rolled anywhere, but I realized I got the dusty chocks off the shelf in the garage, and I had never used them last week, and I was kind of terrified for a moment of, what was I thinking? What did I do? There are so many things like that in life, whether they're positives or negatives. If you go to Brahms tonight after church and you look at the vast array of all the different flavors that are there, you probably have some that you've had a good experience with and some that you haven't. And once you've had one you know you don't like, you don't have to do it again. You know. And once you've had one that is the great one, you look for it every time you go in there, and you're disappointed when it's not there, or like me a couple weeks ago when you jumped the gun and then saw it later and realized you messed up. When you believe something, it changes what you do. And so since we see that within regular life, you think of last week with the eclipse, everybody buying those glasses. Why do you do that? Because have you ever met anyone that is blind because of an eclipse? Not that I know of, but yet you know that that's a thing that they say happens, and so you go and you get the little, we all trusted our vision to paper glasses with something on the side of it that said they were okay. But because we believe these things, we do things differently. And that's the world James talks about here in James chapter 2. So James 2, we'll start in verse 14. What good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can that faith save him? So he asked this question about faith, what faith without works might look like. And the questions he asks are, first of all, this: what good is it? What good is it if you believe something, but it doesn't change anything? What good is it if you believe something, but the things you do are not done in such a way that shows you believe that thing? And we probably have found ourselves here at one time or another in all kinds of things in life, where you know the thing you should do or the thing you shouldn't do, but for whatever reason, you do it anyway, or you don't do it. And you think, well, I knew better. Why did I do that? Why am I here again? And when it comes to God, just the idea of belief, it's great to have belief, but without any kind of action that backs it up, what good is it? And the second question he asks is, can that faith save him? So if it's not any good when it comes to what it looks like in life, is it any good with what it comes to in salvation? Now, James seems to tie the idea of action together a lot with the idea of being a Christian. And so some people look at James and Paul and think, if we got these two guys in a room together, would they butt heads on this issue? Because this question of can that faith save him almost seems directed, if we're reading it from afar, at what Paul says in Ephesians 2. In Ephesians 2, verses 8 and 9, Paul says this, "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing, it is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast." So it feels like there is kind of this faith and works argument going on between James and Paul. Paul is very much resting on the idea of faith, and even to the point of saying not a result of works so that no one can boast. And then James, on the other end of the spectrum, seems to be saying, well, what good is faith if there are no works? And I think it's another of those questions where there is a yes kind of answer. Both of them, what they're saying is true, but they're kind of addressing different things. And I found a really good explanation of this, of do James and Paul disagree? I don't think they do. I think they're talking about something different. In a book called James, Faith That Works, the author says this, Paul was fighting against tradition which promoted a false work salvation. So if you think of Paul, if you're in Jeff's class talking about Galatians right now, if you're not there already, you will get to a point where there is a struggle within the church at Galatia because people are struggling with letting go of the old law. And so basically they're saying these new converts, you have to do the old law and all this new stuff. You can't be saved without both. And Paul is saying, no, the new came to replace the old, and you don't have to worry about the old law. There's kind of this conflict between them. So Paul's fighting that, as he writes to the Ephesians also, the idea of faith. James was fighting against a light faith, which minimized the necessity of works after coming to Christ. I love this phrase and hate this phrase at the same time. Light faith. I went to Applebee's today for lunch. I got the Pepsi Zero Sugar, which is like Pepsi without the fun, I guess. I don't know. It's okay, but you know you're not getting completely the full thing. There are a lot of things like that in life. I already mentioned Brahms. If I'm feeling the way that I should feel and acting wisely, I will get the no sugar added, or I will get the frozen yogurt. If I'm feeling, see the butter brickle in the case, it's a totally different thing. But I know the good, but so often we want this light idea. And so a lot of people do the idea of light Christianity. So you hear people say, I like the idea of Christianity, I like God, I like the Bible, I don't like church, so I'm kind of got to do my own version of this thing. Or you might, and I believe I've mentioned this somewhere along the way before, we had Little Rock radio stations when we were in Searcy. There was a big mega church in Little Rock that was advertising their 30-minute service. So you could come in and get all of the worship time for your week condensed into 30 minutes. You're probably thinking that sounds like a dream right about now. You get it condensed down to that, and that's all you have to do. And so it became something that if I just put in my 30 minutes a week, almost like it's going to the gym or something, then I will get the result I'm looking for. And so as Paul is struggling with, let go of the old law, James is struggling with, well, don't let so loose of it that you don't do anything. And they're having this trouble between the two of them. So Paul says works cannot bring us to Christ, which is true. The idea of works, now, we may see the works of others, and it may cause us to ask questions and have conversations, but at some point there is faith involved in coming to Christ. Paul's right about that. James says after we come to Christ, they are imperative. And if you remember back to grammar, when you learned that long, long ago, imperative means they're commanded. Works are commanded for us as Christians. So I want to really center in on those two phrases here. Paul is fighting against tradition which promoted a false work salvation, and James is fighting against the idea of this light faith which minimized the necessity of works after coming to Christ. So for us, Are we fighting against any false traditions, as Paul was? Are there things that we latch on to that are things that are not important, things that are not relevant? And I'm sure there are. There are a lot of steps that we may take, and I don't know what those are for you. If I start mentioning them, I'm probably going to make somebody mad at some point. But there are a lot of things along the way in your life that you have probably been told, this is an absolute. And then somewhere along the way, you begin to realize, like the church there in Galatia, maybe this is not an absolute. I've mentioned to you before the little country church I went to that had the order of worship on the wall as you walked in. And it was not that week's, it was every week's. It was, song, prayer, song, communion, and you had to do it in that way. Anything wrong with doing it that way? No, nothing at all. Is that the only way to do it? I hope not, because we didn't do it this morning. We do it differently than they did, and then we would be in the wrong. But there are a lot of things like that where there are these things that we latch onto, these extra steps that we put in, things we may struggle along to try to make a big deal of. And then on the other end of the spectrum, do we believe in the necessity of works? In that imperative, as it was put in the quote that we read, the idea of a command, a necessity. You must do this. So when we're in churches of Christ and we talk about, do you believe in the necessity of something, what follows there? Is baptism a necessity? And we forget sometimes that maybe it's not the only necessity out there. Maybe there's some other things too. So once you come out of the water, what do you have? According to Paul in Romans 6, new life. So what is new life within our world? Well, that's something that is just starting, isn't it? It's not something that's finished. It is the idea that you're going to have this thing that then carries on and goes places and does things. And so you have this new life where there is, as James would describe it, a necessity that works are involved in that. So maybe we need to ask ourselves the question sometimes of not just, have you been baptized at some point way back when, which is clearly an important thing, but what have you done since then, and what are we doing now? And that's what James is addressing here in James chapter 2. So we'll continue on, maybe. Here we go. In verse 15, if a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warmed and filled, without giving them the things needed for the body, what good is that? So what this leads me to ask is faith without action really faith at all? If faith is one of those things that drives us, think back to the question we started with, how does what you believe change what you do? If you have faith, but it's not doing something, do you really have faith? And I don't know that we have asked ourselves that question a lot. I know Christians historically probably have not. They have rested on the idea, we believe in God, we've confessed His name, we've been baptized into Him, and then everything's kind of good at that point. But that faith is something that should be doing. And so James, as he makes this example, the idea that someone who is in need and your response to them is basically, well, good luck with that. How helpful do you think it is? This is without getting into all the arguments about what are they doing and what is the situation. I get all of that. But does it change anything for them if it's just words? And when you find yourself there, does it change anything for you when it's just words? And to take this out for a moment of James's example of someone who is poor and in need, what about just all the general things with brothers and sisters where there is a need there for comfort, for help, for encouragement, whatever it may be, if we're not willing to do something in the midst of that? When there's a need that comes up, when there's a ministry to be done, if we're not willing to get in the middle of it and do something, is our faith working, or is it just words? And it's easy to say the words and they sound good and you feel good about it, but have you ever been guilty of saying, I will be praying for you, and that's the last time the idea of prayer for whatever that is enters your mind? Have you ever been guilty of telling someone that you will help them with something and then life gets busy and you forget? I was thinking today as I was at church, I got a text from someone earlier this week about something, and it hit me this morning. I got that and I was in the middle of something and thought I would come back to it and respond, and I still haven't come back to it and responded. And so I need to sit down and figure out, okay, what was I thinking? What was I going to say? What am I going to do? We have moments like that all the time where we just get in the middle of busy life and we forget. Or sometimes maybe we've convinced ourselves that just the words are enough. And James will say, no, they're not. There's something more than that. So is faith without action really faith? Continuing into 1 John, John moves the idea from faith, I think, to love, which is something we've talked about a lot lately. But John says basically the same thing with love. In 1 John 3, verse 17, he says, but if anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? And so maybe the idea of is faith without action faith at all? Is love without action really love? Are we loving someone if it is just we say we're loving and we're trying to portray love in some way, but we're not doing the things that accompany that? And when it's our close relationships, we're usually pretty good at this, aren't we? You don't forget important things for people that are really important to you, but sometimes as it begins to get further and further out, you miss some of the opportunities. And so John would say, not only faith in action, but love in action too. So back to James, verse 17. So also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. So how does what you believe change what you do? If faith is dead without works, is that faith any good to us, or are we living differently? What does it mean when you live this new life for Christ? How do things look different for you? In verse 18, he says, someone will say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. And doesn't this just sound like a religious debate? Well, faith or works, or which one's more important? Anyone can do good works. And this, by the way, is one of the struggles we have in our world today. There are a lot of people in our community, in our state, in our nation, in our world that are doing a lot of good things for people. There are community organizations that do great things. There are even governmental things where they're doing things to help one place or another or do something. There are a lot of good things going on that have nothing to do with faith. And so sometimes for us, it's a challenge as we're doing good things because of faith for folks to even notice that. And so James says, well, it's not really like a one or the other kind of thing, but sure, people can do good works. And then on the flip side of that, in verse 19, he says, you believe that God is one and you do well. Even the demons believe and shudder. And so not only can anyone do good works, anyone can believe too. Even the demons believe. So when we say, hey, we have this great faith where we believe, I don't know if you're in the company you want to be in on that, because demons have that too. There's something that goes beyond that. So just believing is not enough. Just having faith, a faith without action, is not enough. In verse 20, he says, do you want to be shown, you foolish person, that faith apart from works is useless? So think of the strength of the words he's using. Faith without works is dead. Faith without works is useless. What do we do with things in our lives that are useless? I have a box. If you were to come into my house and look in this basket I have a basket full of cables in my house. And maybe a lot of you have one of these too. I already see smiling and laughing. I have a basket full of cables, and my wife periodically will say, why are we keeping these? And I will say, because we might need them. And every now and then, it's like once every 2 or 3 years, we will need one of those cables. And I will say, aha, here's this, we've got this thing now, and a cable went bad, or we got a new thing that needs to be connected. And I went to the magical basket of cables, and there it is. And there's a need for this. My wife, on the other hand, I guarantee you, when I go, the first thing that's going to go is that box of cables. It's not even in the will for anybody. She's just going to rejoice in throwing it away and moving on. Maybe she'll bury me with them. I don't know. We have things in our world that are useless, things in our life that are useless. And generally what we try to do is, let's get this out of our lives. And so James, who is writing in a book that seems so centered on faith, is telling us there is a kind of faith that is not even worth having. The kind of faith that so often people who are trying to follow Jesus will argue for. It's enough that I believe. I believe that he's God. I don't have to do anything else. I've just got to be kind to people, that kind of thing. There's not another thing that comes with it. And James would say that kind of faith, it's useless. So what makes a great story of faith? And I love what James does here, because he could choose from any of them, but he chooses two. And he chooses two that are Old Testament stories and tells a very brief piece of each of them, one of Abraham and one of Rahab. And I would imagine two very different kinds of people. as we think of their stories and what they do. And yet there is this nugget of faith within the stories that shows us so much about what's important. So what makes a great story of faith? First of all, what he says about Abraham. Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up his son Isaac on the altar? And you'll remember, if you were here last Sunday evening, we referenced Abraham 2 through, I think it was Romans chapter 4's look at Abraham, talked about him not wavering in his faith, which if you read the story in Genesis, it kind of feels like he does. And yet he keeps coming back to the right place with God. He's supposed to become a great nation. Isaac is the son this is supposed to happen through. And then God tells him to go and sacrifice his son. And although there may be questions going on in his mind, and we have a little bit of insight into that, but not a ton, on that journey there, his attitude is, and especially when Isaac asks the question of where is the lamb for the sacrifice, God is going to provide. When you're looking at the story from the outside or even from the inside of the people experiencing it, that doesn't make any sense at all, does it? I mean, we're going to a place far away to have this sacrifice. We're taking everything we need except the lamb, and Abraham knows why. And yet his attitude is, God will provide. His attitude is, God can still do something here even if there's a sacrifice made. He sees who God is. And so Abraham goes and he was offering up his son. And notice also the way James explains it. He offered up his son on the altar. Not he was considering it. This was a done deal in Abraham's mind. This was a sacrifice that had been made, which is why God was able to react in the way that he did, knowing Abraham's faith in what he did. You see that faith was active along with his works, and faith was completed by his works. So not only is his faith active in the midst of it, but faith without it, and here's another descriptor, it is dead, it is useless, it is incomplete. Your faith, if there are not works that accompany it, is always going to be lacking in something. And so his faith is completed by his works. And the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness, and he was called a friend of God. So his faith not only goes through his own works, but it changes his relationship with God so that he is a friend to God. You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. So even though Paul talks about being saved by faith and that works are not there so that we can't boast, once we are in this saved state, there is something we are to do now. And we are justified by the works that we are doing because of faith. And in the same way, verse 25, was not also Rahab the prostitute justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out by another way? So the spies come in, and Rahab is there, and they are trying to, the powers that be are trying to catch the spies, and Rahab hides them, lets them out, and there is this salvation that comes to them through Rahab, of all people. And Rahab doesn't strike you as the most religious person on earth by any means in what she does for a living and where she lives, but what she does know is a little something about God. And she relays to the spies, and she understands these rumors that have been heard about what the Israelites are doing and what God is doing through them and his power and how he is supporting of them. And it has given her a faith in what God is doing. Isn't it interesting that somebody like Rahab could see what God is doing and the evidence of that and come to a faith based on that, but not just a faith that says, I believe this. Not just a faith that says, clearly there's something about this God that you serve and he is powerful and I believe in all of that, but she's going to change what she would otherwise do. And here's another little element that comes from time to time, risk. There is a risk both with Abraham and Rahab, at least in a human sense, not knowing exactly what God will do, but that he can. And so she puts herself on the line to help out God's people. She is justified by the works that she does, not just by the belief. So what makes a great story of faith? Trust in God that is confirmed by action. So to trust in God is great. And that is definitely a thing that we want to do. We want to know God is faithful. We want to understand he's powerful. He will do what he says he will do. We want to know that he loves us, and he has made that clear time and time again. But based on all of those things, we then do something different than we would have done otherwise. In verse 26, it says, for as the body apart from the spirit is dead, so also faith apart from works is dead. So the question for us tonight is your faith dead or alive? Because it seems to me, as I look at James, this is an either-or kind of question. There's not a lot of variables in between. Your faith is either one that is in words only, or it is one that is doing something. Which one are you tonight? And if you are not one who is doing things based on faith, understand this is an imperative. This is not something that is optional for us. It's not something that we can kind of take or leave. There is not a version of the Christian life that does not involve Christian actions, actions of love, actions of faith. We are to be different people because of who we are. Or as we asked the question in the beginning, how does what you believe change what you do? When I was in 6th grade, there was a guy that came into our classroom and showed us all the terrifying things that can happen in a car accident on a VHS cassette way back in those days. And we watched all these horrible things and everything, and they were trying to convince us as 6th graders that we needed to wear our seatbelts. Now, it's a different day and time now. I know I'm talking to the Sunday night crowd, and you remember, but I can't even remember seeing anyone put a seatbelt on in my family before I saw that video. I don't remember wearing one as a kid. I remember riding on the ledge in the back window on my mom's Buick LeSabre when I was a kid. I remember sleeping in the floorboard. I was all over that car. I remember leaning up between the seats all the time, and no one thought there was anything wrong with that, and it's just what you did. I don't remember what the click sounded like until I saw it in the video. And after watching that video, I thought, I don't ever want to get a car in again. And the video worked on me. I was the guy that he came for. And I went home, and I told everybody in my family, do you know these things are in our cars? I mean, we're not doing anything with them. Here they are, and I just worked on them and worked on them and worked on them. And gradually, one by one, people in our family started wearing their seatbelts. And then they started making it a law and all that kind of stuff. But long before that, it was choice. And I will tell you, I can't think of very many times since 6th grade I have not gotten into my car and immediately seatbelt every time. Why? It gives me a better shot. And so I do something differently based on this thing that I have learned. I don't want baptism and the Christian life and all those things to be a escape the fear of hell kind of thing for people. But it should change how we live. It should change who we are. And so it begins up here, but it doesn't end up here. It goes throughout our lives, making us different people who people can see by the way we love, by the way we live out our faith, and we become changed people. And you can become, as a result of that, like I was as a 6th grader, you can become the evangelist, not of the seatbelt, but of telling this story to other people. So much more important than the seatbelt story even. They need to know about Jesus and what he did for you and what he will do for them, and we can take that message to them. Tonight, if you have never followed him before, it is the beginning of a journey. And it is a wonderful feeling when you come out of that water, but I hope there are a lot of wonderful feelings that follow as you're living for him, loving others for him, and living in a different way. Or if you have forgotten some of those things and kind of been coasting for a while, it's easy to do. And there are a lot of people in our world that are trying to follow Jesus and just kind of coasting in neutral right now. You can turn it up a notch. This may not be a come forward kind of thing, but I hope you'll think about, how does what you believe change what you do in your life? How does believing in Jesus make you a different coworker, different employee, different family member, different student, different teacher, different neighbor? How does it change things for you? And if it hasn't, let this be the day you reset that and be a different person because of the faith that you have. If we can help you in some way tonight, please come while we stand and sing.